we cannot envision a long-term sustainable future for the Amazon and for its protected areas without considering the human and local economic aspects. So, offering economic, sustainable livelihood alternatives for local communities are important so that we can reduce pressure on the forests, strengthen ecosystem services, and ensure the long-term achievements of a program such as ARPA. So there are still things that we need to work, to invest, and to build new initiatives to make sure that we have a future where the forest, the biodiversity, and also the people living in the forest are resilient in the long term.
Welcome to Nature Breaking, a World Wildlife Fund podcast focused on the news and trends affecting our natural world and the people and species who call it home. I'm Seth Larson. Today, we're celebrating an important milestone, the 10th anniversary of the largest tropical forest conservation program on Earth. It's called the Amazon Region Protected Areas Program for Life, or ARPA for Life for short. And since 2014, it's helped provide the resources required to protect 150 million acres of the Brazilian Amazon. That's an area larger than the state of California. As we've covered before on this podcast, the Amazon rainforest is one of the most biodiverse places on Earth, containing about 1 in 10 of all known species. It also stores an abundance of carbon and regulates regional weather as the moisture from the forest contributes to rainfall in one of the most important agricultural regions in the world. In short, we all have a stake in keeping the Amazon rainforest vibrant and intact. And ARPA for Life is the single biggest initiative attempting to do that. 10 years in, we now have a sizable snapshot of both the successes and the opportunities that this kind of initiative can create. So, joining me today to reflect on 10 years of ARPA for Life is Dr. Mariana Ferreira, Director of Strategy for WWF Brazil. Mariana will share some of the history behind the creation of ARPA for Life, what it's accomplished over the last 10 years, and what the next 10 years might bring. Here's our conversation. Okay, I am joined now by Dr. Mariana Ferreira, Director of Strategy for WWF Brazil. Mariana, welcome to Nature Breaking.
Thank you, Seth. It's great to be here talking to you today.
Yeah, so happy to have you here as well. So let's start by bringing our listeners up to speed on the origins of ARPA for Life. And I want to start by quickly defining a couple things. So ARPA is a conservation initiative that supports a series of protected areas established by the Brazilian government in the early 2000s. And ARPA for Life is the funding mechanism established in 2014 to make sure that those protected areas have the resources they need to effectively conserve the rainforest. Am I describing that correctly? And if so, can you explain just a little more about how the original ARPA program got started?
Yeah, sure, and you're right.
Great.
And the program was initially conceived as an initiative, almost like a challenge of the Brazilian government to protect 10% of the Brazilian Amazon with the support of WWF, the World Bank, and others. The initial goal was to conserve around 50 million hectares of protected areas. And when I say protected areas, I'm talking about national parks, biological reserves, but also important areas for traditional community livelihoods that here in Brazil call extractive reserves. Currently, the program supports 120 protected areas, and it actually surpassed the initial goal. It reached over 62 million hectares, which is kind of equivalent of 20% of the remaining Amazon forest in Brazil.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah, it's a lot of hectares, and it actually was responsible for the creation of 27 million hectares. So the program not only supported the establishment of these areas, but it will support its consolidation until 2039.
Wow. Okay, so that's a great background baseline for what ARPA is. But we're really here to celebrate the 10-year anniversary of ARPA for Life. And so I want to talk more about that. And I wanted to just start by asking, basically, why was ARPA for Life needed? You know, if ARPA for Life is the funding mechanism to support the protected areas established through ARPA, can you tell us more about why there was a need for this to be created? What were some of the challenges that the ARPA program was experiencing in its early years that ARPA for Life was intended to solve?
Sure. So when it began, the program, the resources for the initiative were coming from more a traditional funding model, where we had a fund and investments on the protected areas were only on the revenues of this investment.
I see.
But in the early years of the program, we were able to have a more precise estimate of the costs of creating protected areas and managing them. So we knew how much exactly it would take us to establish and consolidate that set of areas in the long term. Many protected areas were created and then incorporated into the program. So it became evident to us that the funding available and the model available at this point would not be enough to sustain the program in the long term. So we need to come up with a new mechanism, which was then the initial start of the process for conceiving ARPA for Life.
Yeah. And I want to ask you to just talk a little bit more about this, because I think a lot of people, when they think about national parks or protected areas, they just think that the government draws a line on a map and says, this area is protected, we're not going to do any development there, and there, how much more cost can there really be to it? But can you talk a little bit more about the activities and the resources that need to go into actually making those parks effective and durable?
Yeah, of course. Once a protected area is created, you have almost like a peak of investment, which is the initial implementation phase of this protected area, which means like you need to develop a management plan for that area. You need to establish a conservation committee or a board engaging local people and local stakeholders in the management of the protected area. You need some structures, infrastructure, equipment. So this is the initial cost. But it doesn't end at this point, because there's a lot of management activities that are needed to actually implement that protected area to make sure that it fulfills its objectives.
Yeah.
So there are activities regarding biodiversity monitoring, research, engagement of local community, environmental education, tourism management, protection. So there are a lot of activities that does have a cost, and it's important that people are aware that for the areas to actually provide the benefits that they were created for, they need this investment.
Great. So let's dive a little further into ARPA for Life specifically. ARPA for Life was the first ever Project Finance for Permanence initiative supported by WWF. Project Finance for Permanence, otherwise known as PFP. I'll just use that acronym going forward. We've covered PFPs a little bit on this podcast and some other episodes, but I think it would be great if you could briefly explain to our listeners what a PFP is, and specifically to ARPA for Life, how this PFP was designed and structured.
Yeah, so ARPA was not only the first PFP, but it's also the largest one to date. And what does it mean for ARPA to be based on a PFP approach, right? It means that the program has a structure that helps it to establish public policies and also secure the necessary funding to meet its goals in the long term. Mm-hmm. So you have to, in the initial stages of the PFP, it requires a fundraising of a specific amount based on a lot of estimates and studies that are done through a single closure approach. And once you have this, that's what we call the transition fund, it begins supporting the management and consolidation of the protected areas. This fund will gradually be replaced by budgetary allocations from the government, but also alternative funding sources. So what is important about PFP is not that it's only a PFP, it's not only like a funding model, mm-hmm. but it's also because it foresees the achievement of milestones by the partners, by the government, and it also has a very well-structured governance, that it helps the program to ensure its sustainability in the long term, even in a scenario of financial or political instabilities.
Yeah. So, in other words, that seems really important to me, and I want to talk more about that in a second. So basically, you create this fund, and donors contribute to it. The government pledges to meet certain milestones in order to gain access to disbursements on a specific schedule, right? So it's not that a lump sum is given all at once. There are these closing conditions that are agreed to, and the money doesn't keep coming unless the government keeps meeting those milestones. So that brings us right to our next question, and what you just alluded to about political durability. These PFPs and ARPA for Life in particular are designed to last forever, hence the word permanence in their title. And Brazil really became an important test case for that promise, right? President Bolsonaro was elected in 2018, and his administration famously rolled back support for forest conservation. And I want to ask you to talk a little bit about how ARPA fared through the years of his administration.
Yeah, it was a very challenging period, and while other funds were blocked in these years, the ARPA's governance and financial mechanism were severely stress tested.
Yeah.
And we faced an increase in deforestation in the Amazon in general because of the dismantling of the environmental law enforcement. And it also resulted in increasing deforestation in Amazon protected areas. We have more than 87% of increase in deforestation inside protected areas in this period.
Wow.
However, when we look at ARPA's protected area, the increase was only 40% of what would be expected if we didn't have the support of the program. So the ARPA's funding profile, its operational mechanisms, its solid governance were the pillars that, in a way, ensured that the program was not discontinued or changed away from its original goals in this period.
That's really impressive and encouraging, and I think it speaks volumes to the effectiveness of this model that during a time where the government was hostile to conservation efforts and was rolling back these protections, and we were seeing deforestation skyrocket all around, the level of increase in the areas protected by ARPA was significantly lower. And now there's a new president as of a couple of years ago in Brazil, and ARPA has continued on into that administration, and it's continuing to drive really important impacts. I want to ask you next, we've been talking a lot about conserving nature and protecting the rainforest, but how does ARPA for Life touch down with people and communities? Because ultimately the funds provided by ARPA for Life are providing jobs and resources that make a difference for people in Brazil, right?
Yeah, so as I mentioned before, half of the protected areas supported by ARPA are areas that are important to secure traditional communities' land use rights and the resources that they sustainably use. And when we look this in terms of area, it covers more than 23 million hectares, and an estimate shows us that in these areas there are more than 1,500 communities. And we know that well-managed protected areas, which have strong social organization and governance, they provide very important benefits to the quality of life and to local subsistence. There are people inside these areas, they are promoting community-based tourism, extractive of sustainable resources, and the areas are very well conserved.
Yeah, can you talk a little bit more about that? Because, again, I try to put myself in the position of a listener who may know a little bit about how these things work but may not be an expert. And I think a lot of people are surprised to hear that there are people living in or near protected areas or national parks. Particularly, I think in the U.S., we think of protected areas and national parks like Yellowstone National Park in the U.S. is a famous one.
Yeah.
There are no people that really live in the park. It's only for tourists to go in and out of, and there might be people camping overnight or something, but no one really lives there. It's very different around the world. And can you just talk a little bit about how that works in Brazil, and when you talk about how many people are living in these protected areas and how many communities are present there, Are we talking about indigenous people who have lived on that land for generations? Who is living there, and what are their lives like?
And there might be some indigenous people overlapping these protected areas, but in Brazil we have a specific category, and for indigenous peoples there are indigenous lands, and these areas are not under ARPA. We're talking mainly here about local communities, so fishermen, extractivists, that also have been living in the forest for centuries and working and surviving based on the resources of the forest, and more learning how to be part of a local economic or even national economic context through the products that they produce based on usually non-timber forest projects. So I'm talking about fibers, nuts, seeds, community-based tourism, fisheries. So they are all local communities, usually very well organized, that are part or support the management of these areas. And we see very significant and important levels of conservation in these areas. So there is a way that we can promote conservation and avoid deforestation, and working together with these traditional communities.
Yeah, it's a wonderful partnership, the way ARPA for Life supports those communities and includes them as partners in the initiative. And it seems to be really effective, right? You spoke earlier about how effective it's been, and we're continuing to see that play out. What other key accomplishments has ARPA for Life achieved so far? What else would you like to tell our listeners about in terms of what ARPA for Life is producing for results?
Yeah, and there are some numbers that really highlights the impacts of ARPA. So for instance, WWF has been assessing protected area management effectiveness since 2005 in Brazil. It's almost like a rank of the level of effectiveness of each protected area, where 100% would be the top. And what we can see is that back in 2005, protected areas supported and not supported by ARPA were in similar positions. They had around 40% of management effectiveness levels. And these numbers keep raising over the years, but protected areas supported by ARPA reached in 2015 almost 62% of management effectiveness level.
Wow.
While protected areas not supported by the program in 2015 were around 49%. So we can see different curves in the improvement of the management effectiveness of the areas supported by the program.
Wow.
Also, last year, we did an analysis and published this analysis to quantify the impact of ARPA in avoiding deforestation and CO2 emissions. And what we came up is that between 2008 and 2020, the reduced deforestation promoted by protected areas with ARPA support was equivalent to 260,000 hectares. And when we look at this in terms of carbon, we are talking about more than 100 million tons of CO2s, which is kind of equivalent to the total carbon emissions by American domestic aviation in 2020.
Wow.
So that's something that we also need to highlight, is that protected areas, and especially well-managed protected areas, are an important and effective tool to combat deforestation.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we're increasingly seeing conversations about climate change and climate action include forests and keeping forests intact and stopping deforestation as a really important tool in efforts to fight climate change. And I know Brazil's going to be hosting the UN Climate COP in 2025, right? Which will be a big moment to showcase the effectiveness and the importance of forests in the global climate fight. So those numbers, I think, will encourage our listeners to get even more excited about the power of forests in that effort. But it's absolutely staggering that it's that big a number. So let's look forward a little bit. I want to just highlight something that you mentioned earlier in the way ARPA for Life and other PFPs are structured, and that's that, they are really built to enable a country's government to eventually take on the full cost of conservation financing in the long term, right? So where are we in the process of that life cycle for ARPA for Life? And what's your long-term vision and hope for how the Amazon rainforest is going to continue to be protected once the ARPA for Life funding mechanism winds down?
Yeah, I think that we talked a little about it, that the costs for implementing and consolidating protected areas, they must be part of the global resources mobilization efforts.
Yeah.
There is usually a lot of funding and support for establishing these areas, but then for maintaining them in the long term is usually a challenge. Of course, that we are also considering innovative financial mechanisms and instruments that could be an important part of the solution. And then what I'm thinking when I say this is nature-based solutions, debt restructuring, payments for ecosystem services, and actually Brazil is very well positioned to access these funding opportunities. Having said that, I think we talked about it too, we cannot envision a long-term sustainable future for the Amazon and for its protected areas without considering the human and local economic aspects. So, offering economic, sustainable livelihood alternatives for local communities are important so that we can reduce pressure on the forests, strengthen ecosystem services, and ensure the long-term achievements of a program such as ARPA. And this is not a given, There are gaps to establish this, there are investments that are still needed. So there are still things that we need to work, to invest, and to build new initiatives to make sure that we have a future where the forest, the biodiversity, and also the people living in the forest are resilient in the long term.
Mariana, that is a beautiful vision for the future, and thank you so much for painting it for us. I think we can leave it there. I really appreciate your time today in talking us through the ins and outs of ARPA for Life and helping us celebrate this 10-year anniversary. It's such an impactful program. It's made such a big difference, and we're really excited to see what results it produces going forward. So thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Seth.
Thanks again to Mariana for that really educational conversation about conservation in the Amazon. As I said in my intro, ARPA for Life represents the largest tropical forest conservation program on Earth. So it's great to celebrate the milestone of its 10th anniversary, but we also want to hold up this initiative as a model for other countries to look at going forward. In the years since ARPA for Life launched, WWF and partners have supported the creation of similar PFPs in Bhutan, Colombia, and Peru. And we're working with partners through the Enduring Earth Coalition to establish more PFPs in the years ahead. These initiatives have a big role to play in helping countries meet their climate and biodiversity goals, and we hope this episode helped illuminate just why they are so important. So thank you for listening, and together, let's keep building a more sustainable future.